They told you Charleston was a city of elegance, white-columned mansions, silk gowns under gaslight, gentlemen sipping wine in polished parlors, but what they never told you is that beneath the oldest oak in St. Michael's Cemetery, 9 men screamed in silence as the earth closed over their coffins. Their fingernails clawed wood until they split. Their eyes stayed open in the dark. They were alive, buried alive, and the secret of who put them there and why was locked away for nearly a century, until a leather-bound journal surfaced, its pages written by a man who should have been broken, but instead became the most dangerous kind of enemy. One who waits. His name was Solomon Fairfax, and tonight you will hear his story. But hear me clearly. This isn't just history. This is forbidden history. The kind of knowledge meant to rattle your sense of safety. The kind of revelation that makes you look twice at the institutions you were raised to trust. Because when men of power believe themselves untouchable, something ancient awakens in those they crush beneath their boots. Something patient, something merciless. Solomon had been born to heal. His hands were meant to pull fevers from children, to mend broken bones, to soothe suffering. But the system of Charleston, the plantations, the auctions, the smug aristocracy smiling behind lace curtains, tore away his wife, his children, his very reason for living. They burned his world, and in that fire a healer died, and a patient hunter was born. The journal begins with a single line, written in a steady hand beneath the flicker of a candle. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. That was the seed. Over 4 years, it would grow into something so meticulous, so coldly calculated that Charleston's most powerful men, the very architects of human misery, would find themselves paralyzed, conscious, and lowered into the soil while still alive. You've heard stories of ghosts, of curses, of vengeful spirits haunting graveyards, but this was no ghost, this was no myth. This was one man who turned knowledge into a weapon, patience into execution, and grief into a design of perfect terror. 9 men went into the earth, none deserved to come out. And as you hear this story unfold, you will feel the descent Solomon chose. The descent into a darkness so complete that even death was forced to wait. Charleston in the 1850s was called the crown jewel of the South. Rice and cotton built dynasties, fortunes flowed along the Cooper River, and society's elite strutted as though God himself had ordained their dominance. But behind the facade, everything they owned was purchased in blood. Every banquet, every glittering ball, every polished silver goblet was held up by human suffering. And it was here, in this gilded city of cruelty, that Solomon Fairfax was forced to endure the breaking of his soul. He had lived as more than a slave. He was a healer, a man whose skill kept plantation children alive through fevers, who delivered babies, who stitched wounds with steady hands. He was respected, even valued, but never free. He married Celia, the love of his life. Together they raised 3 children in the narrow shadow of the Pemberton plantation. For years that fragile family was tolerated only because Solomon's knowledge was too valuable to discard. But in March of 1851, all of it was torn away. His master's debts demanded liquidation, and debts in Charleston were paid in human flesh. Solomon's wife and children were dragged to the slave market, their bonds sold to strangers who vanished with them into the endless machine of southern bondage. On the road to that market, Celia fell, struck her head, and bled while the traders drove the wagon forward, her life deemed worthless. By the time the auctioneer's hammer fell, Solomon's children had been scattered, parceled off to swamps, cotton fields, and house servitude. His family was erased in a single day. That night, Solomon did not cry, he did not rage, he did not collapse. He sat in silence, and for the first time in his life he opened the journal that would become the graveyard of 9 men. His hand, steady as if writing a prescription, spelled out the truth. They think they have broken me. They have only taught me patience. Patience became his weapon. Each passing week, while serving as the indispensable assistant to Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, a physician trusted by Charleston's wealthiest families, Solomon learned more than medicine. He learned the habits, weaknesses, and illnesses of the very men who had laughed as his children were sold. He memorized their schedules, their complaints, their dependencies on compounds and tonics that only he prepared. They thought him harmless. They thought him invisible, but Solomon Fairfax was already writing their death sentences, not in fury, not in haste, but in the calm, precise hand of a healer who had chosen to heal no more. By 1852, whispers began to swirl in Charleston's high society. The slaves were restless, the city was uneasy, and a shadow seemed to follow the powerful men who profited from misery. None of them suspected that the quiet, watchful figure in the background, Solomon Fairfax, the physician's assistant, was already laying the foundation of their ruin. He had access to what no one else in bondage could touch, the locked cabinets of Dr. Hathaway's apothecary. Inside those shelves lay jars of powdered roots, vials of distilled tinctures, and rows of glass bottles filled with clear liquids that shimmered like water but could stop a man's breath. Solomon handled them daily, learning their effects not just in healing but in harm. There was one substance that fascinated him more than the rest. Derived from the curare vines of South America, brought by traders and studied by curious doctors, it had the power to siluo, ents muscle, to paralyze a body while leaving the mind awake. Used improperly, it meant instant death. Used carefully, it created something far worse, a prison within the flesh. The victim would remain conscious, eyes wide open, heart beating, but utterly unable to move or speak. Solomon tested in secret. A rabbit that froze, eyes wide while its lungs struggled. A chicken whose body stiffened as if turned to stone, yet whose eyes tracked his every motion. And in those moments, Solomon understood. He had found his weapon, not a blade, not a gun, but the nightmare of paralysis. A way to strip the powerful of their control, to render them helpless, and to bury them alive in the silence of their own terror. But revenge was not only about the weapon, it was about the stage. He studied burial practices, funeral rites, the construction of Charleston's coffins. He helped prepare bodies for interment, learning how deep the graves were dug, how quickly the earth swallowed sound. He observed the mourners, the rituals, the moments when grief made people blind to detail. Every observation became a note in his journal. And through it all, he never showed his hand. To the Pembertons, the Rutledges, the Devereux families, names that sat atop Charleston's aristocracy, Solomon remained the humble assistant, carrying bandages and fetching water. They looked past him, as though he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the doctor's office. But Solomon saw them, every cough, every limp, every whispered fear of illness. He learned which men feared death the most, which spoke loudly of faith but trembled at the mention of disease. Those were the men he would choose. Those were the men who would feel the soil close over them while their eyes stared into blackness. And when the first master vanished, Charleston would have no idea that the terror had already begun. The first name, in Solomon's journal, was Nathaniel Pemberton, a planter whose cruelty was so infamous that even other slaveholders whispered of it. He was the kind of man who treated punishment as spectacle, who dragged children into the fields at midnight to watch their mothers flogged, who found laughter in the cries of the broken. And it was Pemberton who had overseen the sale of Solomon's wife and children, sneering as the hammer fell at the auction block. For Solomon, there could be no other beginning. But revenge, he knew, could not come swiftly. One mistake, one sign of rebellion, and the noose would find his neck before dawn. The strike had to be perfect, silent, invisible, yet unforgettable. Pemberton would not simply die. He would vanish into the earth in a way that whispered to Charleston's elite that something unseen had risen against them. Solomon began by weaving himself deeper into Pemberton's trust. As the doctor's assistant, he treated the planter's frequent gout, the sores on his swollen feet, the digestive complaints of a man who gorged himself nightly. He fetched laudanum, mixed tonics, and stood quietly in the corner as Pemberton barked orders at his terrified household. Each visit was another opportunity to study him, how much wine he drank, how long he slept, which servants entered and left his chamber. The key came one storm-soaked night in October of 1853. Pemberton had summoned Dr. Hathaway to treat a sudden seizure of pain. The doctor prescribed his usual regimen, but Solomon saw his moment. When Hathaway turned his back, Solomon measured a drop too many of the tincture. His tincture, not enough to kill, enough to silence, enough to lock a man inside his own body. That night, Pemberton collapsed, his mouth struggling to form words as his body stiffened. To the others it looked like stroke or seizure, but Solomon knew the truth. The man was conscious, trapped within his flesh, his eyes wild with panic while his tongue refused to move. In the confusion, Solomon was the calm hand, directing servants, suggesting a quick burial when dead. It seemed inevitable. "The body will rot in this heat," he said smoothly, his voice the voice of reason. "Better to return him to the soil before the fever spreads." And so it was done. While thunder cracked and rain lashed the earth, Nathaniel Pemberton was lowered into the ground, eyes open, lungs struggling for breath beneath 6 feet of wet clay. Solomon stood at the edge of the grave, his face a mask of obedience, while inside him burned the first flicker of justice. That night, as the storm passed and Charleston's lamps guttered out, the journal received its second entry. 1 in the earth, 8 remain. At first, Nathaniel Pemberton's disappearance stirred little sympathy. Death was no stranger in Charleston. Fever and flux swept the city in waves, and the soil of St. Michael's was already swollen with the bones of children and the young. To his peers, Pemberton's burial was unfortunate, but hardly tragic. Some even muttered that the city might breathe easier without his temper darkening its streets. But within his household, unease festered. The slaves whispered that Pemberton's eyes had been open when the coffin lid shut, staring with a terror no sickness could explain. One swore she saw his lips quiver, as though he were trying to speak, even as they nailed the lid down. Another claimed she heard scratching from the grave after the mourners had left, though fear kept her from saying it aloud until days later. By then, the earth was sealed, and none dared dig to see. Solomon heard every rumor, every hushed account, and he wrote them all into his journal. He knew the power of fear, the way whispers could hollow out a man's courage faster than any blade. The plan was not just to bury bodies, it was to bury certainty itself. If Charleston's masters began to believe that death had taken on a new, merciless hand, their arrogance would rot from within, and so it begged. Now, at dinner tables along Meeting Street, Pemberton's sudden illness became the subject of anxious speculation. Why so swift? Why the rush to the grave? Why had no priest lingered for last rites? The men of wealth clinked glasses of Madeira, but their voices dropped to uneasy tones. If it could happen to Pemberton, it could happen to any of them. Meanwhile, Solomon moved among them unnoticed, as he always had, carrying bandages, preparing syrups, standing silently in the corner as plans were made for balls and plantations. To them, he was invisible, but to Solomon they glowed like lanterns against the night, each one a target waiting for his hand. At the grave itself, the silence deepened. For weeks afterward, mourners avoided walking near Pemberton's plot. Children refused to play beneath the twisted oaks where his coffin lay. And on more than one night, a servant swore he heard faint knocks rising from the soil after rainstorms. When the earth softened and sound traveled upward, they would press their ears to the ground, trembling, then run in terror back to their quarters. Solomon never confirmed the truth of those sounds. He didn't need to. What mattered was that the whispers had begun. The city was watching its own shadows now, and the hunters at the top of society had taken their first step toward feeling hunted. In his journal, Solomon added a new line beneath his cold tally. "Fear has been planted. The harvest will come." The city might have dismissed Nathaniel Pemberton's burial as bad fortune, a cruel but ordinary death, but Solomon knew that one death, however grotesque, would not shake the roots of Charleston's pride. To turn whispers into dread, there had to be a pattern, and so he turned his eyes to the next name in his journal, Edmund Rutledge. Rutledge was not only a wealthy planter, but a member of Charleston's elite council, a man who strutted through the halls of power with the arrogance of inherited blood. He dressed in imported silk, quoted scripture with venom, and never missed a chance to boast of the order he maintained among his slaves. That order was built on brutality. Rutledge's whippings were said to be theatrical, performed before an audience of guests to prove his dominance. He was not a man Solomon could allow to grow old. The opportunity came in the spring of 1854. Rutledge had summoned Dr. Hathaway for treatment of night tremors, episodes where he awoke drenched in sweat, certain something unseen was watching him. Solomon recognized the symptom for what it truly was, fear already gnawing at him after Pemberton's strange demise. The city had begun to whisper, and Rutledge was listening. That made him vulnerable. When Solomon prepared the draft of laudanum meant to soothe Rutledge's nerves, he added his secret measure. The effect was slower this time, deliberate. Rutledge drank, expecting calm, but within the hour he found his limbs heavy, his tongue thick, his voice reduced to muffled groans. He tried to rise from his chair, only to collapse, eyes darting wildly in panic, while his body betrayed him. Unlike Pemberton, Rutledge did not die in private. His collapse came during a dinner gathering in full view of fellow planters and their wives. The room erupted in confusion. Servants rushed, women screamed, the physician muttered prayers as if to ward off evil. Solomon stood at the edges, composed, directing the servants toward what he knew would follow. A hurried declaration of death, the insistence on burial before the disease spread. And so, before dawn, Edmund Rutledge was entombed. Not in a quiet graveyard this time, but in the family vault beneath St. Michael's, where the marble slab closed over him and his muffled screams echoed against stone. The servants tasked with sealing the vault swore they heard faint thuds from within as they replaced the slab, but their silence was bought with lashes and threats. This death could not be dismissed. Two powerful men, both seemingly struck down by sudden afflictions, both rushed into the earth before prayers were finished. The coincidence was too sharp, the timing too cruel. Charleston's elite began locking their doors at night, sleeping with pistols near their beds, whispering of curses, of omens, of a reckoning stalking them from within their own city. Solomon, meanwhile, wrote only a single sentence in his journal that night, his hand steady as ever. Two have gone beneath, and now they will begin to fear the soil itself. By the summer of 1854, Charleston was no longer at ease. The death of Nathaniel Pemberton had been unsettling, but the sudden collapse of Edmund Rutledge, one of the city's most visible power brokers, sent ripples of dread through every marble hall and plantation porch. The elite still dressed in finery, still paraded along the Battery with their parasols and polished boots, but beneath the lace and satin, a quiet terror had begun to gnaw. Rumors ran like wildfire, whispered in kitchens, carried by stable boys, murmured by laundresses who overheard too much. Some said Pemberton had clawed at his coffin until his fingers were bloodied stumps. Others swore Rutledge's screams had echoed from his family vault for 2 nights before falling silent. None could prove these stories, but proof wasn't needed. Fear thrives on imagination, and Charleston's imagination was aflame. The city's leaders tried to smother the panic. Newspapers printed bland obituaries citing sudden illness and natural decline. Ministers reassured their congregations that God alone chose the hour of death, but the more they spoke, the less anyone believed them. Behind closed doors, the very men who owned half the county's land were beginning to sweat in their beds. At the same time, the slaves of Charleston saw what their masters could not admit. In the quarters, the story took on a new name, the Earth's Hunger. They whispered of a force that had risen from the soil itself to punish the cruel, to drag them down into darkness. Some believed it was the spirits of the enslaved clawing their way back to settle debts. Others said it was a living man walking among them unseen, a hand of vengeance chosen by fate. In secret, in the still hours of night, prayers were whispered, not for the dead planters, but for the one delivering their justice. And Solomon? He moved in silence, never betraying the fire burning in his chest. To Dr. Hathaway, he was the same steady assistant, measuring powders, preparing tinctures, speaking only when asked. To the wealthy, he was still the invisible figure in the corner, present but unseen. But within his journal his words darkened. Fear now feeds itself. Each death requires less of me, for terror makes them see shadows that are not there. What Charleston did not know was that Solomon had already chosen his next target, and this time it would not be a private man who fell. It would be someone whose death could not be hidden behind excuses, whose burial would make the city tremble with the certainty that they were being hunted. The game had only begun. The third name in Solomon's journal was not chosen for cruelty alone, though cruelty he had in abundance. Richard Devereux was different. He was visible. He was the kind of man who embodied Charleston's pride, a cotton magnate with vast holdings along the Ashley River, a benefactor of churches, a familiar face at every ball and banquet. If Edmund Rutledge's collapse had shaken the city's elite, Richard Devereux's fall would shatter their illusion of safety. Devereux had a weakness: vanity. His home on Meeting Street was a palace of chandeliers and gilt mirrors, and he hosted soirees that drew the city's aristocracy like moths to flame. He prided himself on his vitality, boasting of his health, his strength, his unbreakable blood. To see such a man struck down would prove that no wealth, no piety, no lineage could shield and pardon. Solomon prepared carefully. Weeks in advance he arranged to be present at Devereux's gatherings, under the guise of assisting Dr. Hathaway with his routine visits. He noted the wines served, the way Devereux sipped heavily from goblets, how servants filled and refilled without question. At last, the moment came during a glittering autumn evening in 1854, when the Devereux mansion swelled with music, laughter, and the clink of crystal. The guests never noticed Solomon move among the servants. His presence was as natural as the flicker of candles, as forgettable as the shadow at the edge of a wall. Into a single goblet of wine, reserved for the master of the house, he measured the smallest dose of his chosen tincture, clear as water, tasteless, undetectable. When Devereux raised the goblet to toast his fortune, the room erupted in applause. But minutes later, the applause turned to gasps. His words faltered, his hand trembled, the glass fell and shattered across the marble floor. Before his guests, Richard Devereux crumpled, eyes wide and desperate, his mouth twitching soundlessly as if words had been stolen from his tongue. The musicians stopped. The women screamed. Panic spread like fire. "Seizure," Dr. Hathaway declared, flustered, waving for calm. But there was no calm. For the third time in as many years, Charleston had watched one of its pillars fall. Not to war, not to age, but to something swift, silent, and merciless. Devereux's body was entombed before sunrise, his marble mausoleum sealed with iron. Yet the servants whispered that, as the masons placed the final stone, faint pounding echoed from within. One claimed he saw dust fall from the slab, as though fists struck it from the inside. He said nothing aloud, but in the dark of his quarters, he prayed with trembling hands. The city could no longer pretend. 3 men of power, each collapsing without warning, each hurried beneath earth or stone before breath had fully left their lungs. This was no fever. This was no accident. Charleston was being hunted. And in his journal Solomon drew a single mark across the page, as though carving into the flesh of history itself. 3 swallowed by the earth, 6 remain. By the winter of 1854, Charleston's grandeur had begun to curdle into unease. The gaslit streets still gleamed, the harbour still bustled with ships, and the carriages still rattled along cobblestones, but beneath it all was a sickness no doctor could name. 3 of the city's most powerful men were gone, lowered into the earth with eyes still open, and no one could explain why. The whispers grew louder. Some claimed poison, a hidden hand slipping venom into wine and medicine. Others spoke of African curses, spirits conjured by the enslaved to drag the wicked into graves. Ministers thundered that it was divine judgment for sins too long ignored, though none dared name those sins aloud. At night, the city's grand homes locked their shutters tight, and men who had once laughed at the idea of fear now slept with pistols at their bedside. But fear does strange things to power. It breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds betrayal. Neighbors who once toasted each other with Madeira began to watch closely for signs of illness. "He coughs too often," one whispered. "She fainted at church," another muttered. Behind polite smiles, men wondered who would be next. And worst of all, they wondered who among them might already be working in secret to make it so. The slaves saw the change most clearly. They carried the trays into drawing rooms heavy with silence, where masters and mistresses flinched at every knock on the door. They poured wine into trembling hands, their own eyes lowered, though inside them burned a quiet knowledge. Their oppressors were finally tasting a fraction of the fear they had lived with all their lives. Around fire pits and in hushed corners of cabins, the whispers grew bold. The earth's hunger, they called it still, but now with reverence, almost with hope. Some believed Solomon, though they did not know his name, was chosen by ancestors to balance the scales. And yet no one suspected him. To Dr. Hathaway, he remained the quiet assistant, indispensable, invisible. To Charleston's elite, he was background, the shadow in the corner who fetched bandages and syrups. Even as they locked their doors and clutched their Bibles, they never turned their eyes to the man who knew their ailments, their weaknesses, their fears better than anyone. In his journal, Solomon wrote with cold precision, "They do my work for me now. Fear eats them before I lift a hand. Their walls, their guns, their prayers, all are turned against themselves. Soon, the soil will open again." And in those words lay the truth Charleston could not yet see. The true weapon was not the tincture nor the coffin. The true weapon was terror, sharpened in silence, spreading like a poison in the very air the masters breathed. By early 1855, the city's fear had become almost unbearable. Carriages rolled quieter through the streets, conversations at soirees trailed off into nervous silences, and every cough or fainting spell seemed like the first sign of an unseen curse. 3 powerful men were in the earth, their deaths cloaked in whispers too strange to dismiss, and yet no culprit had been found. The city was beginning to rot from the inside. It was then that Solomon chose his 4th name, Colonel James Ashcroft. Unlike the others, Ashcroft was not just a planter, but a veteran of war, a man who wore his uniform at social gatherings and strutted as though bullets still whistled past his ears. He was known for his cruelty on the field and off it. During the Seminole campaigns, he had boasted of torching villages. On his plantation, he made a game of forcing men to fight one another for scraps of food. To strike Ashcroft was to strike not just wealth, but the eyes, illusion of invincibility, the myth that violence could protect the masters from the justice of their own victims. Solomon's plan unfolded with precision. He knew Ashcroft suffered from chest pains, what the doctor called soldier's heart. The colonel relied on tonics to steady his pulse, mixtures Solomon prepared with meticulous care. Into one of these doses, Solomon measured his tincture. Unlike the sudden paralysis he had used before, this time he slowed the descent. Ashcroft felt his arms grow heavy, his chest tighten, his voice falter. He staggered in the presence of his household, his bravado melting into wide-eyed terror as his body betrayed him. But Solomon had calculated something more devastating. Ashcroft's burial would not be hidden in the quiet of night or the rushed panic of illness. It would be public. His collapse occurred during a military parade surrounded by officers and civilians alike. As the crowd watched, Ashcroft crumpled, gasping soundlessly, his decorated chest rising and falling in frantic jerks until it stilled. The panic was immediate. Soldiers scrambled, priests prayed, women fainted. By evening, Ashcroft was declared dead and prepared for burial with all the honors of his rank. Drums beat low as his coffin was lowered into the earth, flags draped across the lid. But beneath that pomp, beneath the polished wood and folded colors, Solomon's design held true. Ashcroft was alive, locked within the coffin, hearing the muffled roll of drums fade into silence as the soil pressed down. Charleston could no longer pretend. This was not random illness, not bad fortune. 4 men of power, each struck down without warning, each hurried into the ground as though fate itself were burying them. The whispers of poison grew into shouts. The fear of curses swelled into hysteria, and behind every door, behind every guarded glance, the same question lingered. Who is next? That night, Solomon's journal received a new line carved deep into the page. 4 silenced. The earth grows greedy. 5 remain. Charleston in the spring of 1855 was no longer a city of laughter and opulence. It was a city of whispers. The once golden parlors where music and wine once flowed now trembled with unease. People spoke in half sentences, glancing over their shoulders, convinced that a shadow was always listening. Even the carriages rattling down King Street carried a different air. Curtains were drawn tighter, drivers hunched lower, as though a curse might be riding the wind itself. Ashcroft's death, so public, so theatrical, had done what the earlier burials could not. It cracked Charleston's shell of denial. The grand illusion that power could insulate the wealthy had been shattered in a single parade. Men of influence began avoiding one another, fearing that association itself might be dangerous. Dinner parties were cancelled, church pews sat half empty, and even weddings were hushed affairs with eyes darting nervously at the bride's goblet of wine. The rituals of life had turned into rehearsals for death. The panic was not confined to the mansions. Word filtered down to the docks, the markets, the cramped quarters of the enslaved. The story grew in retelling, each voice adding darker layers. The masters were being buried alive. The masters were choking on their sins. The masters were being dragged under the earth by restless spirits. In the quarters where hope was a fragile ember, this was not tragedy but prophecy fulfilled. They whispered Solomon's name, some with awe, some with fear, but always with reverence. The enslaved had lived long in silence. Now their oppressors were the ones silenced in the grave. Priests thundered from pulpits, denouncing witchcraft, warning of divine punishment. Yet even their words rang hollow, for what kind of God allowed masters to fall while their enslaved survived? The air in Charleston carried a new electricity, a tension that made every cough, very stumble, every flicker of weakness feel like an omen. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the paranoia among the powerful themselves. They began to suspect one another, whispers of poisonings, plots, betrayals. In the smoking rooms of gentlemen's clubs, old allies accused each other of harboring secret grudges. Wives looked too closely at their husbands' cups, and husbands eyed their wives' cooking with suspicion. The poison was not only in the bloodstream, it was in the mind. And through it all, Solomon moved silently, invisible in plain sight. To the enslaved, he was a shadow of deliverance. To the masters, he was an unnamed nightmare. To himself, he was only halfway to justice. 4 gone, 5 yet to fall. The 5th name Solomon carved into his hidden ledger was Reverend Silas Granger. Unlike the planters and soldiers before him, Granger was not a man of the whip, at least not in the open. He was a man of words, of scripture twisted into chains. For years, Granger had thundered from his pulpit that slavery was God's divine order, that the lash was sanctified by heaven, and that obedience was the only salvation for the enslaved. He was Charleston's voice of justification, a holy mask for cruelty. Every Sunday, the masters leaned on his sermons to quiet their own doubts. Every Sunday, the enslaved were forced to listen as their suffering was painted as righteousness. To strike Granger was to strike the moral foundation of the city itself. And Solomon knew this was no ordinary enemy. Killing a soldier or planter sent fear into households. Silencing a reverend would send tremors into souls. Solomon's chance came during a communion service. The reverend's ritual was a spectacle. Chalices raised, bread broken with flourish, words of Christ spoken in tones that made slaves flinch and masters nod with grim pride. Solomon, tasked with preparing the chalice, worked as Cain, reefily as a craftsman carving stone. Into the deep red of the sacramental wine he measured his tincture, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to draw out the agony. When Granger raised the cup, sunlight streaming through stained glass painted him in saintly colors. His voice boomed as he proclaimed redemption, but when the wine touched his lips, something shifted. His words faltered, his hand trembled. The congregation leaned forward, confused, then alarmed, as their shepherd staggered at the altar. His face drained of color, sweat beaded across his brow, and his mouth opened in a silent scream as the cup clattered to the floor, spilling crimson across the marble like a wound. Panic swept the pews. Women cried out, men rushed forward, but the Reverend's body crumpled, his limbs stiffening, his voice choked into a strangled rasp. By nightfall, he was pronounced dead, his coffin prepared hastily as though the earth itself demanded its due. But the burial was not quiet. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, murmurs rippled through the enslaved gathered at the edges of the cemetery. They whispered not prayers but praises. The man who had bound them with holy lies now lay bound in silence beneath the soil. To them this was not tragedy, it was justice written in blood and shadow. For Charleston's elite, however, Granger's death was unbearable. If even God's chosen voice could be struck down, what protection remained? The walls of certainty cracked, faith faltered, fear became hysteria. And in the secrecy of his chamber, Solomon wrote again, 5 in the earth, the lie has no tongue, 4 remain. By the summer of 1855, Charleston was no longer a city of elegance. It was a city besieged by its own fear. The death of Reverend Granger had cut deeper than any lash. He had been the city's moral anchor, the one voice that assured the masters their cruelty was sanctified, their wealth ordained. With him buried, the ground beneath Charleston's faith seemed to give way. Sermons grew frantic, whispered rather than thundered, as if even the preachers feared their words might call down the same fate. The masters fortified their homes, hiring guards to watch through the night. But these guards too began to vanish, slipping into shadows when whispers of Solomon's hand reached their ears. Some were enslaved men forced into watch duty, and they stood silently, knowing the terror their masters paid for could not shield them from justice already in motion. Doors were locked tighter, meals tasted twice, goblets switched at the last moment. Yet none of it mattered, for the fear was not just in food or drink, it was in the very air, thick and suffocating. On the streets, hysteria grew. Servants were beaten for imagined poisons, neighbors accused each other of conspiracies. A hand tremor, a faint cough, even a stumble on the cobblestones drew wide eyes and mutters, "Another one has been marked." The city's wealthiest men stopped shaking hands, stopped drinking together, stopped meeting in the rooms where decisions had once flowed like wine. Their alliances crumbled into suspicion. In the quarters, however, the atmosphere was different. Though danger never left their lives, though whips still cracked and chains still clinked, a strange spark had taken root. Hope. Quiet, dangerous, glowing in the eyes of men and women who had been taught all their lives that hope was forbidden. They whispered Solomon's name like a prayer, like a legend already greater than flesh. Some said he walked unseen in the graveyards, speaking to the buried. Others swore he had the devil's hand guiding his tinctures, but none denied the truth. Masters were falling one by one, and the earth itself seemed to hunger for them. Even the enslaved children who once trembled at the mention of overseers now played games in the dust, pretending to bury invisible masters alive. Their laughter, thin and fleeting, was like a prophecy the city could not sow. Elence. And through it all, Solomon remained calm, steady, unseen. He was the storm within the calm, the blade in the velvet glove. 5 gone, 4 remained. The ledger was more than half complete, and Charleston's collapse had only just begun. The 6th name Solomon inscribed was Bartholomew Crane, a merchant prince who thrived not on land or sermons, but on the invisible chains of commerce. His warehouses lined the wharves, filled with cotton bales, tobacco, rice, all harvested by enslaved hands, all shipped to distant markets to line his coffers. He was not known for brutality with a whip, for he owned no plantation, but his cruelty was colder. He reduced lives into numbers on parchment, transforming suffering into balance sheets, bondage into profit margins. To strike Crane was to strike the very bloodstream of Charleston's economy. Crane believed himself untouchable. Unlike the planters, he mingled with traders from New York, London, even Havana. He boasted that he was too modern, too clever, too connected to fall prey to the superstitions crippling his peers. While others shrank from social gatherings, Crane flaunted his bravado, hosting a banquet at his riverside mansion to prove his immunity to fear. Candles blazed, violins played, and laughter tried to resurrect itself within Charleston's trembling elite. Yet beneath the gilded chandeliers, every eye flickered nervously to their glasses, every hand lingered too long on their forks. Solomon waited for this moment. Hidden in the quiet bustle of the servants' quarters, he had prepared Crane's downfall with a precision born of patience. The merchant was proud of his imported delicacies, wines from France, spices from the Indies. Into a decanter of Burgundy, Solomon slipped his tincture, a clear liquid invisible against the red. He needed no spectacle, no drama. The banquet itself would be the theatre. When Crane raised his glass for a toast, his voice rang with arrogance. To prosperity, to strength, to the eternal order of sea. Charleston! But as the wine passed his lips, his words curdled. He coughed, then laughed it off, only to cough again, harsher, wetter. His guests shifted uneasily as his face reddened, his breath came ragged, and the goblet slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Silence fell, broken only by his strangled gasps. Within minutes, he collapsed across the table, scattering plates and candles, his wealth unable to purchase a single breath more. By morning, his coffin was lowered into the earth as hurriedly as the others, as though the soil demanded no delay. Dock workers whispered of curses traveling with the cargo, merchants muttered about omens in their ledgers. Some ships refused to sail from Charleston's harbor, fearful that death itself might be hiding in the holds. For the enslaved, Crane's fall carried a different meaning. They saw not just a man buried, but the machinery of their bondage faltering. If the merchants could be struck down, then the very trade that profited from their misery might crumble. Solomon's legend grew beyond whispers. It became a storm swelling over the city. And in his hidden journal, he carved the words, 6 gone, wealth rots, 3 remain. By autumn of 1855, Charleston resembled less a city of grandeur and more a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The death of Bartholomew Crane had shaken the very marrow of its economy. Ships lingered at the docks, cargo rotting in warehouses, merchants pacing with trembling hands as contracts collapsed. The lifeblood of the city, the trade of human misery, stuttered like a failing heart. Fear had hollowed the grand avenues, leaving only hushed voices and shuttered windows. Rumors of revolt seeped like smoke through the streets. Some claimed that bands of enslaved men were plotting to rise up under cover of night. Others whispered that voodoo priests had cursed the city, calling spirits from the G-worm rave to drag masters beneath the soil. Every rumor was treated as truth, every shadow as an enemy. In the markets, fights broke out. In the taverns, drunken whispers spiraled into brawls. Overseers beat their slaves twice as hard, not out of discipline, but out of terror that discipline itself was slipping. The paranoia reached such a fever pitch that masters turned against each other. Accusations of poisoning, betrayal, even witchcraft spread among Charleston's elite like wildfire. Friends of decades now eyed one another with suspicion, certain that the hand of death might already be in their own household. Husbands mistrusted their wives mistrusted their servants. Children were watched as though their very innocence could hide treachery. Trust itself had been buried alive. And in the quarters, the enslaved listened. For the first time in generations, they heard the sound of fear flowing not from their own throats, but from their masters. Some dared to smile in secret, others dared to pray, not for survival, but for freedom. Solomon's name was no longer spoken only in whispers. It became a chant, a legend swelling like thunder, a promise that the earth itself was shifting beneath Charleston's feet. Amid this chaos, Solomon remained steady. His ledger was nearly full, and his vengeance sharpened into clarity. The 7th name was chosen, Judge Horace Pembroke, a man who cloaked cruelty in law. For years, Pembroke's gavel had condemned enslaved men and women to the block, tearing families apart with a stroke of polished wood. His rulings had turned screams into paperwork, shackles into signatures. To bury him would not only silence a man, but undermine the illusion of justice itself. And so, While Charleston tore at its own seams, Solomon began weaving the threads of his seventh strike. The city staggered on, blind to the truth, that the storm was not coming. It was already here. Judge Horace Pembroke believed himself armored by law, a man who sat high above the city, untouchable in his black robes and powdered wig. His gavel struck like thunder, condemning men, women and children with the same dispassionate flick of his wrist. To him, the enslaved were not souls but property, flesh reduced to ink on contracts, families ripped apart, lives sold downriver. It was all legal, all justified under his hand. Pembroke had often said with cold certainty that justice must never tremble, yet by 1855 his own hand had begun to shake. He had watched his peers fall, planters, soldiers, preachers, merchants, and still told himself he was different. He was law, and law was eternal. But even he could not ignore the whispers that crept through Charleston's courts. Clerks gossiped, lawyers muttered, enslaved servants glanced at him with something unfamiliar in their eyes, not fear, but expectation, as though his name was already written in the earth. Solomon knew the theatre demanded precision. To bury Pembroke was to bury the illusion of order. He waited for a trial day, one in which a young enslaved boy was being condemned for theft, a loaf of bread stolen to feed his starving sister. The courtroom was crowded, buzzing with tension. Pembroke raised his gavel, his voice dripping with practiced disdain. He lectured the boy about law, about order, about punishment. The boy trembled, the crowd watched, and Solomon, moving silently in the servants' shadows, watched too. The judge reached for his customary refreshment, a cup of water prepared at his desk, clear, clean, harmless, or so it seemed. But Solomon's tincture had already kissed the surface. When Pembroke's lips touched the cup, fate moved swiftly. His words faltered mid-sentence. His eyes widened as the gavel slipped from his hand, clattering across the floor like a thunderclap of doom. His breath caught, his chest convulsed, and in full view of the court he collapsed onto the bench, limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. Gasps filled the room. Lawyers scrambled, clerks shouted. The boy on trial froze in terror and awe. Within minutes, Pembroke was still. The courtroom, his throne of authority, had become his coffin. His body was carried out, stiff and lifeless, and by nightfall the earth had claimed him, as it had claimed the 6 before. For Charleston, it was unthinkable. If even the gavel could fall silent, if even the law itself could be buried, then nothing remained to hold the city upright. Order was dead. Justice lay rotting beneath the soil. In his journal, Solomon pressed the quill deep. 7 silenced. The law lies still. 2 remain. By winter of 1855, Charleston was a city unrecognizable to itself. The cobblestone streets, once gilded with pride, now echoed with silence. Mansions sat dark, shutters nailed shut, as though wood and iron could keep death at bay. Even the carriages of the wealthy rolled cautiously, their wheels muffled, drivers urging horses in nervous haste. The city had become a mausoleum waiting to be filled. 7 of Charleston's giants lay in the ground, each buried alive beneath whispers that no priest could cleanse. Planters, soldiers, merchants, preachers, judges, all silenced, all swallowed by the same hungry soil. The people spoke less now, for words themselves felt dangerous. Even laughter in the streets seemed treasonous, as though it might summon Solomon's unseen hand. But the enslaved whispered more boldly. In the quarters, songs rose in the night, carrying not sorrow but something new, something sharp. They did not name Solomon aloud, but his legend pulsed in their rhythms, in the steady beat of their hands on makeshift drums. Some said he was no longer a man at all, but a spirit walking among them, invisible and inevitable. For the first time in memory, the enslaved did not dream of escape alone. They dreamed of a world where masters trembled and chains rusted to dust. Charleston's elite, meanwhile, tore themselves apart. Some fled the city entirely, abandoning estates to rot. Others locked themselves in cellars with guards who watched them as much as two. Hay watched the shadows, Rumors of betrayal multiplied. Every poisoned goblet, every fainting spell, every sudden cough ignited chaos. A man once known for wealth was found wandering the streets barefoot, raving that the ground itself was whispering his name. Yet two names remained in Solomon's ledger, carved deeper than the rest: Governor Elias Thornton and Major Richard Vance. Thornton was the political heart of Charleston, a man whose decrees upheld the city's pride and bondage. Vance was its iron fist, commander of militias, feared for his ruthlessness in crushing resistance. Together they represented the twin pillars that had held the slave city upright: law and force, decree and sword. To bury them would not simply be vengeance. It would be annihilation. It would collapse the pillars so completely that Charleston itself might crumble into the sea. And so Solomon sharpened his focus, his hand steady, his resolve unbreakable. 7 had fallen, 2 remained. The earth was not yet full. The winter nights grew colder, but Charleston burned with fever. The city was a husk of what it had once been, trembling under the weight of its own shadow. 7 powerful men lay in the soil, their names whispered like curses, their deaths strung together by one invisible hand. Yet the ledger was not complete. 2 names still glared back at Solomon: Governor Elias Thornton and Major Richard Vance, the heart and the fist of Charleston's tyranny. Thornton ruled from his grand estate, a man who cloaked brutality in the silken robes of politics. His words signed laws that chained thousands. His speeches painted slavery as noble, necessary, eternal. He believed himself untouchable, surrounded by guards, his meals tasted, his wine sealed. Yet Solomon understood that fear itself was a weapon sharper than any blade. It was not poison that unmade Thornton. It was dread. Day by day, his skin grew grey, his eyes hollow, as though he felt the soil tugging at his bones. One night, at a lavish dinner meant to display strength, he simply collapsed mid-sentence. Physicians claimed apoplexy, but the city whispered the truth. The governor had been marked, his name written in Solomon's book long before his final breath. By dawn, he was in the ground, hurriedly sealed away, his power buried with him. That left only Vance, Major Richard Vance, the sword of Charleston. He was the last pillar, the man who had whipped men to death, who had ordered firing squads without flinching, who had laughed at the begging of mothers. Unlike Thornton, Vance did not tremble. He vowed publicly that he would hunt Solomon, drag him into the square and make an example of him. He carried pistols at his side, swords at his hip, and surrounded himself with soldiers. But pride is a poison deeper than any tincture, and Solomon knew how to feed it. The trap was simple. Vance was lured to the barracks with word of a suspected plot. He marched in, barking orders, demanding names, demanding blood. But when he raised a goblet, his own goblet, brought from his home, his body betrayed him. Within moments, his voice cracked, his limbs stiffened, his eyes widened in terror. Soldiers tried to hold him steady, but he collapsed on the floorboards of his own fortress, his fists clawing at the earth as though he knew it was already claiming him. That night, Charleston Bow ried its iron fist in silence. With Thornton and Vance gone, the ledger was complete. 9 names, 9 graves, 9 men silenced beneath the soil they once ruled. Charleston itself seemed to collapse inward. The markets faltered, the plantations shook with rebellion, and whispers of Solomon spread beyond the city, carried on ships, told in hushed voices across the south. Some called him a murderer, a devil cloaked in flesh. Others called him justice incarnate, the hand of the enslaved made manifest. And in his chamber Solomon closed his journal at last. 9 are buried. The earth is fed. The chain is broken. His work was done. But the legend did not die with the ink. It lingered, pulsing in the blood of every whisper, every fearful glance, every hopeful song. Charleston would never forget. For the masters, it was terror. For the enslaved, it was prophecy. For Solomon, it was vengeance carved into eternity.